Is your favorite NHL team truly a Stanley Cup contender? You might think you know the answer, but I've analyzed the last decade of Stanley Cup champions, and they all have one thing in common. Well, actually, they have 7 to 8 things in common. Key players that absolutely every single one of these teams have had, and I've compared those teams to the 32 NHL teams to determine who are the true contenders of the NHL. And there's just 5 of them, and I want you to write down who you think they are because I guarantee you will not get all 5. But today I'm going to break down each of the 32 teams and tell you just how close to contention they are this year. And I'll note that this is talking about Stanley Cup contention, not playoff contention. Just because a team is very securely in the playoffs does not mean they are truly a cup contender. And a borderline playoff team could actually be a cup contender if they have all the pieces. And what are those pieces? Well, like I said, there are 8 of them. A true, legit number 1 center, a top line winger, a very solid number 2 center, another top 6 winger somewhere on their lineup, a number 1 defenseman, a number 1 goalie, or a 1A, 1B tandem that is very solid, and then 2 more top 4 defensemen. That's 8 players that every Stanley Cup champion of the last 10 years has had at least 7 of those. As you can see, we have our tier list. If you've got 7 to 8 of those players, you are considered a true cup contender. Teams that with 6 are just 1 piece away. They can potentially add that at the trade deadline and get into the cup contention window. Teams with 5 are close, but they're probably not realistically going to be cup contenders this year. Teams with 3 to 4, they're respectable, but it's unlikely that they're going to actually make a deep playoff run. And then there are the teams that are just not competitive that have 2 or fewer of these pieces. Let's start out with the Anaheim Ducks, who are in the respectable but unlikely tier. They have had a massive improvement this year, but they are still missing a few key pieces, most notably a legit number 1 center and number 1 defenseman. Yes, Leo Carlsson is very good, but he is more of a number 2 center on a Stanley Cup winning team. And ditto for Jackson Lacombe, who is a top 4 defenseman, but not quite a legit number 1. They do have a number 1 winger in Cutter Gauthier and a number 1 goalie in Lucas Dostal. And they might make the playoffs, but they're still a few big pieces away. Next up, the Boston Bruins, who are very much on the fringe of contention. I've said for years, they have a lot of talent on their roster that they just needed to fill out with guys like a legit number 1 wing in David Pastrnak, a legit number 1 goalie in Jeremy Swayman. Now Morgan Geekie has developed into a number 1 center, and they have 2 very good top 4 defensemen in Charlie McAvoy and now Mason Lohrei. They do still need a true, legit number 1 defenseman. Charlie McAvoy is not quite that on a Stanley Cup winning team, and they could also stand at a top 6 forward. Everybody's biggest surprise this year, the Buffalo Sabres, are they cup contenders? I don't think so. They're on the fringe right now. They have really good pieces in guys like Tage Thompson and Alex Tuch on their top line. Mattias Samuelsson this year is playing like legitimate number 1 defenseman on a championship team. And then, of course, behind him, they have some really good guys who would be top 4 defensemen on championship teams like Rasmus Dahlin, Bowen Byram, and Owen Power. Sorry, those Sabres fans who don't get any extra credit for having a glut of those guys. Ryan McLeod playing like a legitimate number 2 center? But unfortunately, that's where things end. I know Alex Lyon has been a great story. He's not quite in number 1 territory, and they don't have a very solid backup to make him a 1A, 1B tandem. And they don't have another true top 6 winger to go along with Tage Thompson. Josh Doan, pretty close. He could develop, but not this year, I fear. Next up, we have the Carolina Hurricanes, and I bet a lot of people said that they are a cup contender, but they're not. They're actually a piece away. They do have a lot of really good players. Of course, Andrei Svechnikov and Sebastian Aho on the top line. Shane Gostisbehere, again, is playing like a number 1 defenseman, even though nobody gives him enough credit. They have maybe 2 of the best second-line quote-unquote players in Seth Jarvis and Nikolai Ehlers in the entire NHL, and Nikita Nikishin has been a revelation for them, but their problem, they don't have another top 4 defenseman. Keandre Miller's play this year just hasn't quite been to that level, and their goaltending is still an issue. I know Brandon Bussey is a great story. I can't anoint him a number 1 goalie, and they just don't have another goaltender to pair him with that makes him a legitimate tandem. And again, this is about them winning a Stanley Cup, not making the playoffs. I think they're almost assuredly going to make the dance. I just don't think that their run is going to go much deeper than it has been in past years because they have the same kind of Achilles heel. Next up, the Calgary Flames, and we'll be quick with this one because they are non-competitive. Yeah, they have Dustin Wolf, a true number 1 goalie. Mikhail Backlund, Kevin Ball would be a number 2 center and a top 4 defenseman on a championship team. The fact that they are being thrust into basically number 1 center and defenseman minutes in this team just goes to show how weak their depth is. After them, we have the Chicago Blackhawks, who are very firmly respectable, but unlikely to go on a deep playoff run. They're on the outside looking in the playoffs, and they are lacking a lot of those elite tier pieces to go with Connor Bedard, who, yes, is playing like a legitimate number 1 center on a championship team. Spencer Knight, a number 1 goalie for them as well. Tyler Bertuzzi would be a fine guy in a championship team's top 6, but that's basically all they have. And then the Colorado Avalanche, who, no surprise, are cup contenders. And not only are they cup contenders, they are 8 for 8 in all these categories. They are just so stacked throughout the lineup. Obviously, you have Nathan McKinnon and Marty Necas as your number 1 winger and number 1 center. Cale Makar is the number 1 defenseman. Blackwood and Wedgwood, a legitimate 1A, 1B. Then Brock Nelson as your second center, along with Arturi Lehkonen as your second elite winger. And then guys like Devon Taves and Brent Burns rounding out the top 4, though you could flip Brent Burns for Sam Malinsky. He's been at that level this year as well. Now, ever since their coaching change, the Columbus Blue Jackets have been on a heater, and they propelled themselves to the fringes of contention. But honestly, their big holes are ones that are going to be very difficult to solve. They don't have a number 1 winger or number 1 center. They do have a number 1 defenseman in Zach Werenski and a number 1 goalie in Jet Greaves, and they have a lot of really good pieces throughout their lineup, like Charlie Coyle, Kirill Marchenko, Danton Matichuk, and Ivan Provorov. Those are all great guys who would be contributing pieces on a Stanley Cup championship team. If they just had that number 1 center or that number 1 winger, they would be a legitimate threat in the East. After the Dallas Stars, who are also cup contenders, unsurprisingly, you got your legit number 1s on offense and defense in Wyatt Johnston, Jason Robertson, and Miro Heiskanen. A true number 1 goalie in Jake Ottinger, of course. Stuart Rantanen, another top 6 wingers who could be a number 1 on any team. 2 really good top 4 defensemen in Esa Lindell and Thomas Harley. Where they are lacking and where they could make a move to add is getting another top 6 center. I know they were thinking Matt Duchene would be that this year, but unfortunately he's had a bit of a down year, so that is a hole that they could look to plug. The Detroit Red Wings look like they're going to make the playoffs, and if they do, they can make some noise. Not quite cup contenders, but they are just a piece away. Obviously, Dylan Larkin, Lucas Raymond, and Mo Seider make up their big 3. John Gibson is playing like a true number 1 goalie. It turns out that that is a big deal that they've been neglecting for years. And then you also got Alex DeBrincat and Simon Edvinsson, who round out their high-end pieces. Yeah, they can stand to get another top 4 defenseman and another top 6 winger, but they're in pretty good shape for the playoffs this year. Edmonton Oilers, on the other hand, they're just on the fringes of contention. Of course, they're being buoyed by their big 3 of McDavid, Draisaitl, and Bouchard. But in spite of their, I don't want to say best efforts, but efforts, they don't have a number 1 goalie. They don't have a number 1 winger to play along with Connor McDavid. They have Zach Hyman, who's a legitimate top 6er, and Matthias Ekholm has been really good for their defense, but they're lacking another top 4 guy. So in addition to obviously getting a number 1 goalie, they could stand to round out both their defense and forward cores, especially on the high-end forwards. Because unfortunately, guys like Zach Hyman and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins aren't quite at the level that they need to be able to really challenge for the Stanley Cup this year. As for the Florida Panthers, I know that it's likely that they're going to miss the playoffs, but they would be on the fringes of championship contention if they made it in. Both Sam Reinhart and Brad Marchand are playing like top-line players. Bobrovsky has had a down year, but combined with Daniil Tarasov, they're part of a legitimately good tandem. Sam Bennett, Carter Verhaeghe, you could do worse for top 6 guys if you're making a playoff run. Of course, this doesn't really count guys like Matthew Tkachuk and Alexander Barkov, who have missed a large portion of the year. Their big problem is they just don't have a lot of good defensemen, something they'd have to improve if they really want to take a chance at a three-peat. Now, the LA Kings, of course, just made a big trade in adding Artemi Panarin, and he does push them to be closer to fringe of playoff contention, but unfortunately they are still just respectable but unlikely. Of course, fired Jim Hiller recently. That just doesn't mask their lack of talent. Yes, they have Adrian Kempe, who's a good top 6er. Brant Clark has been playing really well, but not quite to number 1 defenseman level. And of course, now adding Panarin, and with Kemper in net, they have some pieces, but not a lot of very high-end ones, unfortunately. For the Minnesota Wild, obviously they got bolstered a lot by adding Quinn Hughes, but in my opinion, they're still a piece away. They have two elite wingers in Kaprizov and Matt Boldy, obviously a legit number one defenseman in Hughes. Phil Gustafsson is a top-flight goaltender. And then they also have Joel Eriksson rounding out the top six, along with Brock Faber on defense. They could stand to add another top four defenseman, and honestly, they do need a legitimately elite number one center. Joel Eriksson is good, but he's a number two guy on a championship team, not a number one. Now, Montreal Canadiens fans probably think that they are Stanley Cup contenders, but they are, of course, incorrect. This team is lacking a few pieces, most notably goaltender, as well as number two center. Nick Suzuki, Cole Caulfield, and Lane Hudson are all legitimate number ones in their position. And yes, Juraj Slafkovsky is a legitimate top sixer. They have some good top four defensemen in obviously Noah Dobson, who they added in the offseason, and Mike Matheson. But if there are deficiencies that will doom them come playoff time, it's going to be in goal and down the middle in the second center slot. The Nashville Predators, really a kind of weird team, because I think that they could be on the fringes of playoff contention, even though they're going to probably end up selling. I know I'll get backlash for this, but Ryan O'Reilly is playing like a number one center right now. UC Saros is still a number one goalie, and Roman Josi is a number one defenseman. Add on guys like Steven Stamkos and Philip Forsberg in their top six, and they've got really good pieces. If they just added a couple of defensemen, they would be in pretty good shape. Disappointing Devils are, of course, just respectable, but not likely to make a deep playoff run. Dougie Hamilton, who's being dangled as a trade chip, is a top four player on a championship team, so there should be a lot of interest in him. And even though Jacob Markstrom has been terrible this year, at least he has Jake Allen to back him up and make them a solid tandem. Because he's sure having a little bit of a down year, but he's still playing at a number two center level at least. Of course, Jack Hughes, when healthy, is a legitimate number one winger. They just have not had the other complementary pieces to go along with those guys, and of course, health has been an issue. The New York Islanders, one of the feistier young teams in the NHL, are definitely on the fringe of contention. Matthew Schaefer is a number one defenseman on a Stanley Cup championship team in his rookie year, which is wildly impressive. He goes along with Bo Horvat and Matt Barzal to round out the elite forwards. Then Ilya Sorokin, not just number one goaltender, but the most underrated top tier goaltender in the NHL in my opinion. And then rounding out their team, they have two very solid top four defensemen in Ryan Pulock and, barf a little bit, Tony DeAngelo. Really what they're missing is just one or two guys for their top six that would make them a legitimate threat. For the New York Rangers, absolutely no shock to anybody, but they are non-competitive and they're going to be sellers. Yes, Shesterkin is still elite and Adam Fox is a number one defenseman, but other than that, they just have Mika Zibanejad as a very good number two center on a championship team. On to my beloved Ottawa Senators, who I have been rooting for all year, and I have to call time of death on their championship hopes. They just don't have the wagons. Tim Stützle is a number one center, Jake Sanderson a legit number one defenseman, and Drake Batherson a really good guy to have in your top six, but that's all they have. Obviously, goaltending has been a massive issue this year, but unfortunately, they just have not gotten enough out of guys like Brady Tkachuk and Thomas Chabot this year. Philadelphia Flyers, maybe the biggest enigma in all of the East. Where do they sit? Not really likely to be competitive. They've got good pieces on their team, but only one truly elite forward in Travis Konechny. They've gotten a couple of reclamation projects to play way over their skis in Dan Vladar on goal and then Trevor Zegras at wing, along with Travis Sanheim as a very good top four guy. But that's just about all they have. They're not really in a position to be true contenders right now. For the Pittsburgh Penguins, the revival has been real, and they're probably feeling like this could be one more chance for a cup run with Sid and Gino, but I'm here to tell you that they still are missing a few pieces. Obviously, those two I just mentioned, a number one and number two center for real. And you can add Erik Karlsson, who is playing at the level of a legitimate number one defenseman. They don't have a number one winger. Chilvos and Jari aren't quite at the level of a 1A, 1B tandem that I would say I'm confident in going into the playoffs. They don't really have another reliable defenseman other than Ryan Shea. Anthony Mantha also been a very good reclamation project for them, playing at a top six wing level, but they could still definitely use some support at their top wing and on their back end. Now let's talk about the San Jose Sharks, and God, have I been rooting for them to finally get this fixed, and they're definitely on the right path, but I don't see them as being legitimate challengers for the Stanley Cup. They're respectable, but unlikely. Obviously, Celebrini is elite. He's a #1 center, and Will Smith's been good. He's a top sixer for real. Add on a pretty solid goaltending tandem in Nedeljkovic and Askarov. They've got some pieces there. Where they really need help is on defense. They do not have a single defenseman who even grades out as a top 4 on a Stanley Cup contender. They could also use a #1 winger and then another forward in their top 6. So there's still a few pieces away, but they've got guys that they're hoping can develop into those roles in the future. It's just not going to be this year. The Seattle Kraken, another team that I really have thought could be a legitimate dark horse, but upon doing the review, they're not even close. Like, they don't have a single #1 at any position if they were a championship team. Philip Grubauer having a nice renaissance year, but not a #1 goalie. The only 2 guys who would be like key pieces on a Stanley Cup championship team are Vince Dunn, who would be a top 4 guy, and Jordan Eberle, who would be a top 6er. St. Louis Blues, one of the worst teams in the NHL in terms of how close they are to being a Stanley Cup contender. They only have one piece that would be considered the legitimate ad for a Stanley Cup contender, and that's Justin Falk on the back end. He's a top 4 defenseman, but everybody else that they would expect to be key contributors, Kyrou, Thomas, Binnington, they've all underperformed this year. Moving on to the Tampa Bay Lightning, it should not surprise anybody. This is a Stanley Cup contending team. Obviously, on the top line, you got Gensel and Kucherov, and a #1 defenseman replacing Victor Hedman in Darren Radish, along with an elite #1 goalie in Andrei Vasilevsky. For your depth on the top 6, you got Anthony Cirelli and Brandon Hagel, who both fit the bill. JJ Moser having a great year. He's a top 4 guy legitimately. If they wanted to add another defenseman to maybe bolster their top 4, that would be great, but I wouldn't fault them for relying on Victor Hedman. Maybe the biggest disappointment in the entire NHL this year, the Toronto Maple Leafs. They'd actually be on the fringe of Stanley Cup contention if they made it to the dance, which seems unlikely. Matthews and Nylander are still 2 guys who would legitimately be on the top line of a Stanley Cup winning team. Wool and Hildeby is surprisingly good enough to be a 1A, 1B on a championship team. And then you've got good depth on your forward core in Tavares and Matthew Nyes. Oliver Ekman-Larsson, who's going to be trade bait, is still a top 4 guy for a championship contending team. If they wanted to go for it, they would only really need a #1 defenseman and a #4 defenseman. Obviously, they were hoping that that would be Chris Tanev this year, but injuries have limited them. But if they want to make this just a simple retool and not a rebuild, I think that there's a very viable path for them to be contenders next year. Moving on to the Vancouver Canucks, we won't dwell on this too much. They are absolutely terrible. They only have one player who would be a contributing piece on a Stanley Cup team, and that's defenseman Philip Hronek. They already traded Quinn Hughes. They're going to trade a bunch more players, and I think that that's the right move. They are a complete fire sale rebuild team, and they need to get whatever value they can, and especially unload awful contracts like that Elias Pettersson one. Now, the Vegas Golden Knights are always a championship contender, but I don't think they're quite at that level this year. Goaltending's obviously been an issue, but so is defense. Like, Shea Theodore is not quite a #1 defenseman this year, and they don't have a lot of support for him. He's a top 4 guy, and they have 4 legitimately really good forwards for their top 6 in Jack Eichel, Mark Stone, Thomas Hertl, and Mitch Marner. But defensively and in goal, they are just sorely lacking. I think they're only on the fringes of contention. The Winnipeg Jets would also be on the fringes of contention if they actually could make it into the playoffs. Again, they got like 2 guys who are legit top-line players in Scheifele and Kyle Connor. Josh Morrissey is a #1 defenseman. Connor Hellebuyck, of course, is a #1 goalie. And then they got Dylan DeMello and Gabe Vilardi as depth pieces in their top 4 and top 6 respectively. They would really only need a couple of extra guys to make them true contenders. Now the Utah Mammoth, the biggest surprise to me on this entire list, because I think that they are legitimate Stanley Cup contenders. They check every single box. Up front, you have Nick Schmaltz and Dylan Guenther playing like #1 center and #1 wing. John Marino is playing like a #1 defenseman somehow. I don't understand it. Carl Vajelkma, #1 goalie. Clayton Keller, JJ Peterka are top 6 forwards. Mikhail Sergachev and Nate Schmidt are top 4 on a Stanley Cup team. I don't understand it. Had to check the math a few times to make sure, but yeah, Utah has all the pieces. So if you're going to face the Mammoth in the playoffs, you might want to take them seriously. And then last but not least, the Washington Capitals. And if you remember at the beginning, I said that there were 5 Stanley Cup contender teams. The Washington Capitals are one of them. Shockingly, they might not make the playoffs. They probably won't. But they have everything that you need except a number 1 center. Tom Wilson is a legit top-line winger. Alex Ovechkin could also fill that role, but he's a top 6er right now, playing slightly worse than Tom Wilson. Jacob Chychrun's a number 1 defenseman. Logan Thompson's a number 1 goalie. Dylan Strome is not quite a number 1 center, unfortunately, but is it number 2 on a championship team? And then defensively, you guys like John Carlson and Martin Fehervary, who would be top 4s. If they could end up getting like Nick Backstrom through osmosis somehow, this is a team that could make a deep run. But as it stands right now, they might not even make the playoffs, and that's largely because their power play is pathetic. But there you have it. The Capitals are legitimate Stanley Cup contenders if they made it in, along with the Utah Mammoth, Colorado Avalanche, Dallas Stars, and Tampa Bay Lightning. Depending on the trade deadline, if I was betting on a Stanley Cup contender, pick me one of those 5 teams.